One of the most frequently cited texts in defense of purgatory is 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I hear it all the time, but when we slow down and examine it contextually and grammatically, I have to ask, do they honestly think this is what the text is talking about? Which is what I want to look at in this video. And we will do so charitably, but without compromise. Along the way, we will also listen to some claims from Roman Catholic apologist Trent Horn. Here's the plan. First, I want to steelman the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory using primary source documentation. Then we will walk through a good portion of 1 Corinthians 3 and show why it simply can't mean what they claim. Then at the end, I will have a bonus point for you if you are a Protestant or evangelical. But first, welcome to Canon Creed. My name is Miles, and this is the channel where we are bullish on recovering classical Protestant faith practice and piety, all in a digestible manner. So if that sort of thing interests you, smash the subscribe button and let me know in the comments which Christian tradition you are listening from. So let's begin with the usual claim. When Paul says he himself will be saved, but only as through fire, Roman Catholics typically argue that this is describing a post-mortem purification process, a kind of fire, not of hell, but of cleansing, that purifies the soul before it enters heaven. But it's important to understand that the Roman Catholic Church teaches purgatory not just as metaphor or speculation, but as a real purifying experience for those who die in God's grace but aren't fully sanctified. As the Roman Catholic Catechism says in paragraph 1030, all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation, but after death they undergo purification, so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. Regarding the actual nature of purgatory, Pope Benedict XVI noted that it's not just a milder version of hell, but about being inwardly transformed and made capable of Christ and the whole communion of saints. And so far, that sounds rather reasonable. But here's the part that often gets skipped. Purgatory is also about retributive justice. In Session 6 of the Council of Trent, Canon 30, we read that the Roman Church anathematizes anyone that says the grace of justification remits both temporal and eternal debts, such that there no longer remains a need for purgatory. So that's the fuller picture. According to Roman Catholic theology, Jesus paid your eternal debt, but temporal punishments remain, and purgatory is where those debts are settled. But there's a third component as well. In the Catechism of the Council of Trent, in the chapter on penance, we read, "Satisfaction is the full payment of a debt, for that is sufficient or satisfactory to which nothing is wanting. Hence, when we speak of reconciliation to favor, to satisfy means to do what is sufficient to atone to the angered mind for an injury offered. And in this sense, satisfaction is nothing more than compensation for an injury done to another. But to come to the object that now engages us, theologians make use of the word satisfaction to signify the compensation man makes by offering to God some reparation for the sins he has committed. So in addition to purification and punishment, purgatory also includes the idea of satisfaction, payment for sin's lingering consequences. If someone dies in a state of grace but hasn't made full satisfaction for temporal punishment due to their sins, whether through acts of penance or indulgences, they must undergo suffering in purgatory to complete that satisfaction. So here's the full doctrinal load that purgatory is carrying. 1. Purification of the soul, the completing of sanctification. 2. Punishment, so temporal retributive justice. And 3. Satisfaction, repayment of sin's lingering debt. And that's the threefold burden that the Roman Catholic view must prove from 1 Corinthians 3 to try and use it as support for the dogma. So now let's ask, does the passage support this? St. Paul writes, "According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So what is Paul talking about here? I would argue eschatological judgment, particularly with regards to ministers of the gospel, and I'll break down 4 reasons why. But first, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, Charles Hodge actually delivers a pointed critique here. He writes that Romanists found their doctrine of purgatory on tradition rather than on Scripture. They are glad, however, to avail themselves of any semblance of scriptural support, and therefore appeal to this passage to prove that men are saved through fire. But 1, Paul is here speaking of ministers and of their doctrines, not believers in general. 2, the fire is not a state of trial preceding judgment, but the judgment itself. 3, it's the fire in the midst of which Christ is to appear. And 4, Paul does not say the man is purified by fire, but saved with difficulty, as the idiom plainly means. So with that in mind, let's unpack those 4 points one at a time. So point 1. Contextually, Paul is talking about ministers of the gospel, not every Christian universally. And we know this because of the antecedent verses 5 through 9, where Paul writes, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed. I planted, Apollos watered. You are God's field, God's building." So this is about those who build on Christ's foundation, not about post-mortem sanctification, but about present-day ministry and how a minister builds. But even if we were to broaden this to all believers, the fire in verse 13 tests the quality of the work, not the person. The fire will test what sort of work each one has done. I would contend that the gold, silver, and costly stones represent sound doctrine and faithful ministry, whereas wood, hay, and straw are analogous to false doctrine or shoddy ministry. But even if we set that aside, Paul is unambiguous. It's the work that's tested, not the person. The fire reveals what kind of work each has done. If it lasts, there's a reward. If it burns up, there's a loss. Now, it's at this point that sometimes it's claimed that the Greek word for loss can mean punishment, like Trent Horn does.
The BDAG Greek lexicon says the word loss in 1 Corinthians 3:15 refers to punishment. And in ancient Greek temple inscriptions, the word referred to fines that were leveled against incompetent builders.
And sure, the Greek word does have a semantic range. Most Greek words do. But appealing to the range to try and support this doesn't help if we have a context where the word is used and we can examine that context. In fact, Trent himself had Philippians 3:8 on his slide, where Paul uses this same word for loss, and he says he counts everything as loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. Are we to believe that Paul is suggesting that he was punished for these things? Clearly not. He's not describing imposed suffering or retributive punishment. The context makes that unmistakable. Words mean what they mean in the context in which they are used. That's the case in Philippians, and the same is true of the term loss in 1 Corinthians 3. What we don't see is any mention of duration, place, or purgation of sin, suffering imposed as satisfaction for temporal debts of sin, or souls in an intermediate post-mortem state. But what we do see is gospel ministers, works, and final judgment. Still, though, in his debate with James White, Trent Horn doubled down on this in the cross-exam.
Is the loss of rewards a bad thing for the believer?
This is talking about determining what is gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and stubble. It is what is being shown is the nature of the works. Now, I agree. If my works are burned up, I'm very much a person who is going to be deeply troubled by that taking place.
Okay, so James, if God looks at you and says, you worked with bad motivations as a Christian worker, these were the glorious rewards you would have had, now you will never have them, will you feel bad?
So catch that. Trent argued that a minister losing reward is like God punishing someone for unpaid temporal debts where they're making satisfaction for such. Yeah, that's a category error. Losing rewards for shoddy ministry is not the same as being punished for sin. Paul is describing exposure, not expiation. So yes, it is true that the word loss can mean suffering, but the context in which it is used determines this, and 1 Corinthians 3 does not support that usage, which is why the Protestant interpretation, reward versus loss at the final judgment, fits the passage far better than a theory of purgatory. Point 3. Paul says this testing happens on that day. That's biblical shorthand for the great and final day, the final judgment. And Trent Horn actually recognized this in the opening of the debate. He stated that the text is speaking of eschatological judgment.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul describes Christian workers at the final judgment.
Right, the great final day of judgment, not a post-mortem intermediate state. Paul isn't talking about a private post-mortem process. He's pointing to a public cosmic event, the final day of judgment. A singular day when works are tested, not a cycle of purification happening one soul at a time. We already saw where the Roman Catholic Catechism says that immediately upon death, this occurs for an individual who dies in a state of grace, and it's spoken of as a post-death pre-final judgment purification and punishment. But in 1 Corinthians 3, Paul uses universal judgment language, speaking about the day, a single day wherein this will occur for all builders. And the final point is that the phrase saved by fire is idiomatic. Hodge actually points out that grammatically it means being saved with difficulty or narrowly, like a person escaping from a burning building. This same language appears in Amos 4:11, Zechariah 3:2, 1 Peter 3:20, and Jude 23. It's not describing spiritual purification. It's dramatic imagery for barely escaping loss, which is exactly what will happen on Judgment Day to ministers that build poorly. Their work is lost, though they are saved. In every biblical instance, saved through fire or snatched from the flames is rescue imagery, not a purification process. There's no biblical precedent for using it to describe sanctification or satisfaction after death. But to recap thus far, the portion of the text in focus is about ministers, not every Christian universally. The fire is representative of judgment, not purification or satisfaction for temporal debts. And the fire tests the works, not a person's soul. The day refers to the final judgment, not an ongoing purgatorial process that's allegedly started for who knows how many people at this point. And saved by fire is idiomatic language. But now for the bonus point. Let's now pull back and look at a tactic that shows up again and again, especially in this discussion. And it's what's called the Motte and Bailey fallacy. The Motte and Bailey fallacy is when someone switches between a strong, defensible version of a claim, the Motte, and a more ambitious, controversial one, the Bailey, defending the Motte when challenged, but smuggling the Bailey in when unopposed. So in this case, the Motte is the modest claim. Purgatory is just a post-death purification, man, the final touch of sanctification. The Bailey is the full Roman Catholic dogma, that it includes satisfaction, punishment, suffering for temporal debt, etc. When challenged, they defend the Motte, but when unopposed, they preach the Bailey, and now they're claiming far more than they initially defended. And this happens constantly. When they will show up to debates, they'll do this exact thing. Which is exactly what Trent Horn did in his debate with James White. He would cite C.S. Lewis and Protestant scholar Jerry Walls to say that even some Protestants affirm a form of purgatory, leaning on the soft idea of post-mortem purification, which is the Motte. But he never proved the Bailey, the full Roman Catholic claim, purification, punishment, and satisfaction. And that's precisely the problem. If 1 Corinthians 3 can't support the Bailey, then the argument collapses, no matter how defensible the Motte might sound. It's a bait and switch. So if you're a Protestant, you need to be on your guard against this. And it's also why you don't need to be shaken by this. 1 Corinthians 3 isn't about souls in purgatory. It's about servants of Christ being held accountable for how they built. Which is why, if you're a Protestant, you don't need to convert, you just need to remember.